Thanks everyone for coming in the room. I would like to thank the speakers as well. The title of our session is Tackling Multidimensional Inequalities. My name is Dinar Kale. I am Stream Co-Lead for Development and Economics, and Andrew is the another. We are going to start with Andrew first, who is going to talk about Rosa Luxemburg on inequality and economic crisis, followed by Julia, uh, who is going to talk about the financialization of healthcare, public-private partnerships, and health in Africa. And then Pais bringing back to the environment and family by talking about the loss of environmental capital and inter-organizational development in Peruvian Amazonia. So we will start, and we will have it. We do the first presentations, and then we'll take the questions. Those who are online, it will be great if you raise your hands rather than putting the question in chat. We will pick them up, but it will be better if raise the hands than putting the question in the chat. So first, let me share your slides. And you over to you on that one.
Great. Well, thank you, Dinar. Thanks to Dinar for organising the session. Well, I helped to organise the session, but Dinar was the main man. And to the organisers also, it's great to be here and see so many people face to face. Brilliant. So I was just going to showcase some of my research, start by that, Dinar. Some of my research that this. Go back one.
Background, sorry.
Go back one.
Yeah. Okay, the next slide. This is the first slide of yours.
Yeah, and then the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this short presentation, hopefully short, it's just going to build on those first two of those publications where I've written on Marx and Say's law. I'll explain what Say's law is in a moment, for those of you not economists. So I'll talk about Marx and I'll talk about Rosa Luxemburg. And then the third one, the third article, point to some future research and future development of the argument. I'm quite interested in this Marx's method. It's not Marx's only method, but one of the methods he uses, which is to sort of layer. He layers his theory of capitalism in these abstract layers, and that's supposed to be Hegel, Marx. Learning from Hegel. I don't know if you're philosopher, I don't know what Hegel looks like, but that's Marx building on Hegel's system totality approach, where he looks at where he has layers of analysis. So simple circulation. So Marx starts in the first three chapters of Capital Volume 1. He starts with simple circulation. It's a bit like Adam Smith started, or the natural philosopher starting with the simple idea of how exchange takes place. So in simple circulation, there are no social classes, they're just independent producers exchanging with each other. Simple reproduction, there are social classes, so that loosely fits with today's theme, which is multidimensional inequality. So the dimension of inequality I'm going to talk about is social class. But in simple reproduction, there's no expansion; it's static. All the profits, all the values is consumed by the capitalist in luxury consumption. And then expanded reproduction, we have growth. It's sort of really grand stuff. This, so I'm actually trying to define what's peculiar about capitalism and what's peculiar about how capitalism generates crises. And to do that, the key proposition is Say's law, which Keynes popularized in the 20th century. Keynes just said the proposition is that supply creates its own demand. There are loads of versions of Say's law. So this is really simplified. This is sort of, if I was to teach it in an OU text, I'm trying to simplify it. But Say's law core to orthodox economics. It was adopted by the classics, James Mill. It's in Adam Smith, but it's in Ricardo, David Ricardo. It was quite progressive, actually, after the French Revolution. It was saying that supply will create its own demand, that industrial development can happen, it can be sustainable. it's most easily explained on the conditions of barter. So, say a farmer barters corn for cloth. She supplies the corn and she demands an equivalent in cloth. So they're exchanging corn for cloth. Then that means that the supply of the corn and the demand for cloth are identical. Supply and demand are identical. So supply creates its own demand. If there was no money in the barter, it's easy to understand that way. It doesn't have to be barter, but that's one way of understanding it. Now, Marx took issue with this Say's law under simple circulation, my first layer of abstraction. Can you show this one, Dinar? Thank you. So we've got my farmer, and there's a weaver and a bookbinder. This is an example in Marx Capital Volume 1, and they're all exchanging with each other, but for money. So say it's for 2 gold coins each. The farmer's buying cloth from the weaver for 2 gold coins, and the weaver's giving 2 gold coins to the bookbinder for a book, and the bookbinder's buying corn from the farmer. Now, in simple circulation, Marx says, well, there could be, what happens if the farmer decides to save or hoard the coins? Suddenly, the farmer's not demanding from the weaver, then the weaver doesn't demand from the book. So this is a very abstract basis for crisis theory based on money. But we haven't got a capitalist system here, we've got a simple market exchange system. So it's Marx's first stage, his first critique of Say's law. But that's just a possibility theory of crisis. It's just saying it's possible that the producers will say that there's a possibility of a crisis occurring. To get to an actual theory of crisis, well, Marx never really wrote that book. He didn't write this book on crisis. It's incomplete. People have their own ideas. Looking at Julie, who's got her own ideas on the crisis. So we've got just hints in Marx about what a theory of crisis is. And one place, the 4th volume of Capital, which Marx never wrote, which was assembled, it's called Theories of Surplus Value. There are some hints in there of theory of crisis. I can show you a quote from Marx very quickly, just to pick out. Now here we are introduced in inequality. Now we're introducing social class. We're saying there are wage labourer and the capitalist. And Marx is making the point that once there's a surplus, once the wage labourers, the workers produce a surplus for expansion, for means of production and raw material, for machinery, factories, then they're not buyers anymore. They're the producers, but they're not buyers. In fact, they're overproducers. Majority of the producers, the workers, consume an equivalent for their product only so long as they produce more than this equivalent. That is, as long as they produce surplus value or surplus product, they must be overproducers. So here we've got Marx again talking about Say's law. We're talking about Say's law in a capitalist situation, where there's expansion and there's social class. There's just a hint of how what's peculiar to capitalism, and he mentions in passing, it's an inevitability theory of crisis. So as soon as there's a surplus, as soon as there's inequality, there has to be crises. So it's not, so when we think about capitalism, think, well, things are becoming more unequal, well, we might be more prone to crisis. But the very fundamental of capitalism, what's peculiar to capitalism, is that because of this inequality, because the producers overproducers, they can't consume everything. It's down to the whim of the capitalists to invest in the means of production, which is why we need Keynes and we need Gillespie, we need the whole gamut of heterodox economics, because investment is so important. Now we can do that. This is just a hint. So we can find, I've been finding some interesting material in Rosa Luxemburg.
Yeah. That's the one.
Yeah. This is taken from a graphic novel on Rosa Luxemburg by Kate Evans called Red Rosa. I don't know if you know, but Rosa Luxemburg was in prison during the First World War. She was anti-imperialist, anti-war, and she was imprisoned by the German government. And the cartoons, is just to try and get over how devastated she was during the First World War. But before the First World War, in 1913, she wrote her great economics text, called The Accumulation of Capital. And in section 2 of Accumulation of Capital is where she sets out a critique of Say's law. And she reviews all the classical economic literature from Adam Smith and Ricardo all through the 19th century. There isn't time for me to go through all of it, but one thing that's particularly interesting is she picks on a key follower of Ricardo, who was called McCulloch. McCulloch was a Scottish, a lot of the political economists were Scottish, and McCulloch had the first, they think he had the first chair in political economy, chair in economics in England. He was chair at UCL, at the University of London. It so happens as well that Rosa Luxemburg is thought to be the first woman to do a PhD in economics. So here we have the first woman to do a PhD in economics, criticising the first chair in political economy. And she breaks down McCulloch's argument as to when or under what conditions Say's law supply creates its own demand, under what conditions Say's law doesn't hold. More specifically, she argues to ensure that Say's law holds. McCulloch says three things. You can see her having a go at McCulloch and his connection to the Liberal Party and orthodox economics. So the first thing is that she says that basically that McCulloch is just assuming there's no surplus value for Say's law to hold. So she's saying that McCulloch is going back to simple circulation, the first layer of my list of abstract modes of production. The second one, she's saying, well, he's just assuming that on another occasion, McCulloch, in another place, McCulloch is just saying, oh, for Say's law to hold, all the surplus value has to be consumed by the capitalist. So he's assuming simple reproduction, the other layer. And then on another occasion, he's going all the way back to barter. He's assuming that there's no money, which was the example I gave when Say's law works quite carefully. So this is quite interesting that she's systematically, through critique of political economy, she's working through how Say's law, when it holds, when it doesn't hold. She also, which I haven't got time to talk about, she's very sophisticated on money in accumulation of capital, which is one thing I've written about. She's very sophisticated on how money circulates and how that relates to the theory of price finance. And we probably all know that those people in development, that she's a theorist of imperialism. But once Say's law doesn't hold, supply doesn't create its own demand. She argues that the demand, colonies, imperial expansions need great demand, one of her arguments. The other thing to say finally is that the person who wrote the introduction to Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital when it came out in the 50s was Joan Robinson, Cambridge economist Joan Robinson, and her great tract, which I wrote about in the final article, is also called Accumulation of Capital. So to work out actually what happens with demand and supply in terms of the structure of production, Joan Robinson is a way forward, a way to work that out. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next one, thanks Andrew for that timely presentation and staying the time. The next one is Julia. Will share your slides.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Dinar, and also thank you to the organizers. It is really nice to be in a room with people and actually have the opportunity to network and share research. So grateful that I have the opportunity to present some ideas from our ongoing research project funded by the OSD program. So, I mean, I guess it is a manifestation of capitalism in crisis, because what I want to talk about today is health inequity. And the title of the presentation is financialisation of healthcare, and I'm going to speak about what I mean when I say financialisation in a bit. And I want to zoom in on public-private partnerships, because it sounds like something really great, and it is something that's being presented as like the silver bullet, especially across African countries or countries of the global south. Generally, in the UK, they have already been faded out because they have proven to be quite costly, but still they're being so widely promoted. Not only in infrastructure or energy projects anymore, but also in the healthcare sector, with quite some disturbing consequences. So maybe just to start and really like trying to make the link also of what it is that our panel is trying to address today is like health inequities are there, they exist across the globe, and health inequities are not just like differences in health outcomes, right? I mean, that might be of biological nature, but really quite avoidable. They're the outcome or the consequence because people live in different conditions, work in different conditions, will have thus also different health outcomes. They're quite unfair for that matter and can actually be addressed by the right mix of policy. I think I mean, during the COVID pandemic here in the UK, you might have read a lot about some of these health inequities, Black and brown people being much more affected by COVID and so on. And access to healthcare as such is very often a key dimension that we need to discuss when we talk about health outcomes and health inequities. And here now making the link to the global south, the African context in particular, which is what we try to focus on. In many African countries, access to healthcare is still not guaranteed. And within these countries, we then see some skew, it's also skewed, and there's also some inequity in it. Like, is it regional, geographical? Differences. People of poor socioeconomic background very often don't have access to healthcare because in most places it's tied to a household's ability to pay for healthcare privately. And I've mentioned racial disparities, which also apply very often to countries of the global north. So in this, well, the reality of us like still having this massive amount of health inequities today, this new-ish narrative of we need to achieve universal health coverage is being really widely propagated. Just on a side note, it replaces an earlier narrative around primary universal care. So also the replacement of the word care to coverage is quite significant, because in the 1970s, when this massive narrative around primary healthcare for all, health as a human right, was being discussed, it was very much so tied to like an idea of a much more an international economic order that's much fairer. It was in the post colonization periods. So these demands were on the table. Today, in both like the discourse of course the World Bank, but also the World Health Organization, also sometimes NGOs or very often governments, less focus is put on how we're going to achieve universal health coverage or how services are going to be provided. There is the definition reads nicely, right? Everybody should have access to all healthcare services and should have access without like enduring financial hardship. But in reality, there is less, it's very unprescriptive, or like if we look into the realities of many countries, how universal health coverage is being implemented is quite different. Just one point I want to mention here is that what is part of this new narrative around universal health coverage is a reinforced role now for the private sector. And it extends, it's not only the private sector in terms of private provision, maybe some outsourcing of some specialized services and so on. It really has shifted to an emphasis on having the private sector as a financier of healthcare across countries of the global south, particularly, but also this narrative is very much relevant for the African context, because it's always like, oh, African governments don't have the resources to actually provide healthcare equitably for their population. So we need the private sector, very often like international capital, to come and actually fix this for us. This is tied to quite some problems that are already documented in the literature, right? Private healthcare is very often associated with even further creation of health inequities. Not always better quality, right? The narrative is always, oh, but it's more efficient, it might be better, and so on. The public systems are underfunded and thus like unable to actually serve populations. But very often there is not really a system of regulation in place, right? And like private care, especially in the African context, can be any person who's able to set up like a store at the corner and so on. So also to challenge this notion that private care is necessarily better care. And I mean, during the COVID pandemic, we've seen how Spain had to renationalize its health system. The UK went about it differently. In this context, public-private partnerships come in and are now presented as like, okay, true. The private is not perfect, public can't do it, so let's work together, right? Win-win scenario. And I'm providing a sort of definition of PPPs, but just to say, public-private partnerships are being interpreted also quite loosely, and people have different ideas of what public and private cooperation means. In the context that we're looking at PPPs, we really think about PPPs as a long-term agreement that like a public entity enters into with a private entity. And I'm going to show an example in a bit. But like the government side or the public side is very often locked into a very long contract in these arrangements. And it's good for governments because they don't have to spend the money right away up front, right? So if like a private provider or private consortium builds a hospital, it's true there will be some, let's say, burden on the budget, but it's spread over a longer period of time. So that's very often the rationale for governments to say like, okay, maybe that's actually a really good idea. But the emerging literature also on PPPs in health specifically already shows that there are issues that are related to the narrative, and also like just the fact that in the UK they're no longer being promoted as such for a private finance initiative shows that actually the cost burden is much higher than not even anticipated. People are quite aware of it, right? But it's in the interest very much of the private sector that's looking for new ways of making that continuing the accumulation of capital to do so in sectors that are considered to be public social services traditionally, but provide a new avenue for profit making. So I'm apologizing for this slide. It's a bit like messy. I'm not sure if you can see the colors, but we're trying. So I'm doing this work with two colleagues at SOAS and with partners in Kenya and Lesotho. So it's really very much ongoing. And this graph is more or less modeled on like one of the PPP hospital projects in Lesotho, which was like being presented as like this flagship hospital project by the World Bank. No longer operational. The government prematurely terminated the contract. So we're interested in finding out what happened. So which is why Lesotho is our one of our case studies. But just to say, so here we see, I mean, on the gray bits on the my right side, we have the public side, right? Very often it's the government or a Ministry of Health. Or so what we also observe is that it could be like even like the state government, right? So not necessarily even only at the federal level. So private consortium also approach like maybe a state government and so on, often with less financial potency, you want to say. And then on the other side, we have the private sector party. And I think what's interesting here, and it's, as I said, a bit like messy, the presentation, but very often we have a company, in the Lesotho case, like Nextcare, which is a South African company, that sets up a consortium. So it's not the company itself that enters into the contract, but it like creates like some abstruse like special purpose vehicle that enters into this contract. And everything that happens to this consortium happens to this consortium. The company is fine, right? No matter if this project goes down or not. So it's a great set for the private sector. Right? It's a complete transfer of risk. Because what then happens, these companies that enter into this consortium, very often it's several, they provide super little capital. So I mean, in the Lesotho case, it's less than 1%, 0.9% of their own money went into this hospital construction. The rest were loans, very often from development finance institutions. So again, that's aid money that goes to a private sector instead of actually going to like serve and provide healthcare. And the government has to underwrite these loans. And then what they also do, they don't only take loans from public like development finance institutions, they take loans from their own company. So this consortium goes and takes a loan from Nextcare itself. And the interest payments, again, are underwritten by the government. So already the setup shows that like there is massive opportunity for interest and profit making. These companies are very often registered in Mauritius, Cayman Islands, I mean, all these places where they're also not very tax liable, and tax evasion is really an issue. How resources provided by the government, because they still have to pay annually a fee and an upfront payment, are kind of siphoned away. And in Lesotho, this really happened. Like the cost was inflated for the government of Lesotho, its budget. Even the World Bank, right? I mean, the Oxfam reports it at like slightly more than 50%, but even the World Bank is not denying this number, right? That like half of its budget of the Ministry of Health in Lesotho went into just like basically making sure this hospital, which is a specialist or a tertiary hospital in the capital city, functions. But that has obviously implications again here now for health inequity. That means like the rest of the country has very little resources available to actually ensure that, like, especially primary healthcare and other areas of the country actually is being provided. So the last bit that I want to say, I mean, that's to me that's what was also on this slide that was like slightly complicated. That's why it's better to move on here. Is that like the World Bank in particular is playing an important role in promoting this setup, right? So although there is some emerging literature saying like there are issues with PPPs, we've seen these issues emerge in other places like the global north. We have seen these issues emerge in like infrastructure projects and so on. Now it's being the World Bank really continued this promotion of public-private partnerships in health as the new way of like achieving universal health coverage and overcoming this financing gap that exists across the board. And in what we've done in the first step in preparation for now doing some field research is really trying to like we mapped like countries across the continent, 54 countries, to see which countries have regulatory frameworks in place that like enable PPPs. We've seen that most countries do so, a majority do so, and very often we see that this process of transforming the legal framework has been facilitated by the public-private infrastructure advisory facility, which is hosted and administered by the World Bank. And if it's not directly administered by them, they found different ways through programs and so on to still promote this whole narrative of changing legislation that allows for PPPs. In the healthcare sector particularly, we haven't, in the African context, seen that many directly World Bank funded, World Bank Group funded, the IFC is its private sector. We haven't seen that many directly funded like PPP in health projects, but we've seen a lot of like their World Bank projects, IBRD and IDA grants being, or credit, being tied to some idea of like, yes, but you have to like trial this PPP in health project there. You have to change the framework in this way. So even if direct funding isn't coming through, they're really preparing the terrain for other areas, right? Because I mean, many other private sector entities find this setup great, right? No risk and loads of money regularly to actually be rolled out. They use like other platforms, global health PPP, like the global financing facility, right? Another influx of money to again tie this idea that PPPs in health are the way forward. They also really, when we really mapped, we tried to go through this best reviews. I'm sure this is not exhaustive and they must be doing much more, but we really found proof of like a public expenditure review report in health, like saying like, or we come to the conclusion that PPPs in health is the solution. We find high health financing strategies that the World Bank is drafting in collaboration with the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Finance, promoting these PPPs. So across all documents, it's really quite clear that the World Bank is promoting this, and they're using other forms of thought leadership really to do so, having like specialists promoting it on LinkedIn. They have an own training program with accreditation if like your Ministry of Health officials come and take this course of PPPs in health and so on. So a whole range of things they use. And just, yeah. So I'm going to skip this. This is just a graphic representation of the thoughts, the tools they're using, and this is the map showing that basically now all countries on the continent are have like written PPPs in their own health strategies. So this is now the national. We looked through all the national health strategies and plans. This graph is a little bit of work, but just to say, 9 countries, I think, don't make explicit mentions of public-private partnerships in health in their health policies. All other countries by now do, right? So it looks like we're going to see many more health PPPs in the coming years. And really, just to end, to say like this is something that we think needs to be looked at in more detail. There's the next health financing conference, the 4th round, coming up next year in Madrid, right? Like the last one kickstarted this whole trend around like financing for development now needs to include private finance, and knowing that like capital will always try and look for an outlook, like an outlet, another way of accumulating even more capital, and already the emerging evidence that like the drive for profit within the health sector is quite incompatible with like the true meaning of like achieving universal health coverage. We really do think it's important for us to look at this dimension and to pay attention to not only the privatization, the invitation of private providers into the healthcare system, but this ongoing promotion of including and pulling private finance into national healthcare system.
Nice.
Really briefly, I got a comment from online, if we can move the table a little bit, because I couldn't see the speaker so well. Would you mind doing that?
Yeah.
And then they can. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks for
Thank you.
yeah. Over to you, Thais.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My presentation might go a little bit in a different route. I'm going to discuss how the loss of environmental capital in Amazonia is tied to the issue of intergenerational poverty. This is more a case study of Amazonia, but actually speaks out about the broader Latin American context and how we target rural poverty without looking at the environmental injustice issues that shape that rural poverty in the first place. So to explain a little bit my case study, my former research was in Peru, but I actually have an active OSD that is comparing different contexts in Amazonia. And what I'm going to discuss about Peru is actually very common throughout the region. So a lot of the social protection programs that exist and that are targeting poverty in this context, they frame poverty as a behavioral issue. So they try, for instance, conditional cash transfers, which are the most popular ones. They attempt to try and change or shape the parental behaviors about children, help parents invest in children's education somehow. And there's also school meals, trying to reinforce school attendance by offering meals for children who might, and the perception of the policymakers, struggle to access meals otherwise. These are very important and have been very successful programs overall. However, at the same time, you can pass one. However, at the same time, they are very much tied to the commodities boom in Latin America. So Latin American economies in general export a lot of commodities. In the case of Peru, Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, oil and gas are very important, but there are other commodities as well. They are very particularly tied to Amazonia. In the case of Brazil, there's different kinds of minerals in Chile and Argentina. However, this is basically the economic growth model in the region. It's just that you extract and you sell these commodities, and then there's this whole promise that by making this profit from these commodities, you can then fund social and economic inclusion. And this seemed to be very successful in the period between the 2000s and 2014, which is when most of these programs of conditional cash transfers, school meals, etc., they were being heavily funded and expanded into Amazonia. They were first tried and tested in urban contexts and then expanded into Amazonia kind of at the end of this period. So my research looked at this in 2018-19, so basically 4 or 5 years after the first pilot implementation of this in most Amazonian communities. And to just give you a little bit of context of what this extractive expansion means for Amazonia. So the first oil boom, big oil boom, happened in 1970s. There was a lot of conflict, actually territorial conflict between different countries who were bordering the territory that found oil, so basically Ecuador and Peru and Colombia. So that means, as you can see in this map, a lot of the oil territories were actually in indigenous regions. So this obviously had very direct consequences on this population. So in 1978 in Peru, they have the first law of native communities, which is basically given the right for indigenous peoples to have formal territory. However, in the same law, there is a text saying that whatever is not indigenous territory is the territory of the state, and the state is interested in expanding extractive activities either by oil and gas or by agribusiness as well, which is another form of commodity soil and palm oil in particular, which are used for biofuels. You can click again. Click again, sorry. And again. So then this model of social protection in Amazonia pretty much focused on the idea that indigenous peoples were living in monetary poverty, which is true to some extent. And then you can see in this map of Peru in particular, how the areas that have higher rates of monetary poverty are also, interestingly, the areas that have very high interest in resource extraction. So there's most of the red area that you see in the border is Amazonia, but that different red area there is one of the main mining states in Peru as well. So you can go a little bit more, Dinar. So in the government targeting system, when they were thinking how we're going to find the people who need assistance, they measured annual income, families' access to services, considered their geographical location and the property of individual households. However, this was a challenge in Amazonia because many of the families in this context relied on subsistence agriculture, so they couldn't really show an annual income. They had a kind of shared property ownership where people contribute together to buy what they need. So again, they couldn't really show property of individual households. They have a system of circulation of children, which is quite common for many indigenous communities in this area. So even though people were sometimes you would send the money to one mother, but actually who was raising this child was an aunt or a grandmother. And they sometimes have multi-local households because of the conditions of the territory. Sometimes you have floods in the region and the families will move elsewhere for a certain period. So all of this made the inclusion of indigenous households very challenging. And the solution that the government found to ensure that the programs reached these communities was basically to say, if you live in Amazonia and if you're indigenous, and by the definition of indigenous, you have to speak a native language or live in your original territory, then you have a condition of extreme poverty, and automatically you receive this program, which from the perspective of the indigenous families that I talked to was a problem because it also influenced the view of frontline officers and implementers that indigenous peoples are culturally in a situation of poverty because it creates a disassociation between ethnicity and poverty. But at the same time, it led to a 72% increase in the coverage of these programs in Amazonia. So you can. When I talked to these families, the families that were receiving assistance, however, they didn't really understand this idea of poverty as being a problem of you not being able to send your children to school or you not being able to afford food. Actually, food, if you pass it against them. What parents said often is that the world is barren in the sense that the soils don't produce as much food anymore or that water is polluted, so you can't really rely on what you had on your resources anymore to live out of subsistence agriculture and fishing. Children themselves, in an exercise that we did of mapping the territory, they would mention how the water is polluted, how this water is coming from the boats and plastic in the river. And a teacher as well that I talked to was mentioning that if you don't have fish in the village, if the water is too polluted and the fish went away, obviously children won't have what to eat, but this is not a problem of the family buying resources, it's a problem of pollution. And you can move again. And what I found really interesting as well, children, this drawing in particular is one that children did of an oil boat, which was very common in the village. You would see the oil boats coming by. And talking to Ricardo, who was the president of an indigenous organization in the region, he also mentioned that he felt that the problem of poverty was actually tied to how we measure poverty. Governments will often think that it's about what indigenous peoples eat being not enough. They would phrase the anemia problem, for instance, as, oh, your diet is insufficient for children. However, he would argue, if you eat in a very traditional indigenous diet, you wouldn't starve as long as you had the resources available. And what generates poverty is actually the big industries that are expanding in Amazonia and reducing the resources for the families. So based on this, my project now is trying to understand what this means for climate adaptation and what this means for how we conceive of social protection during climate change. So in this particular area where I was working, and these people that I work with, they are riverine people, and they are very used to the occurrence of floods. It's actually part of their economy even, because there are certain crops and certain fish that you catch during the flood season, etc. However, you have a good flood, which is this depiction of a good flood where you can navigate through the forest more easily. Sometimes fish are easier to catch because they are coming into the village. Game is easier to fetch because they will, like monkeys will be over the trees close to you. However, what is happening nowadays more and more often is that you have bad floods, which are disruptive, which are unexpected. You can't really time them as well as you did in the past. And it can destroy houses and crops. Very often it is doing that kind of on an annual basis. And it's because it's becoming such a common phenomenon, people cannot adapt to it as easily. And most of the social protection programs that we have proposed at the moment as a solution to this are also, again, cash transfers. However, we can move to the next one. What I think is very important to consider is that when you talk to, in my previous research, when I talked to the families about how they envision the future of the children, what they wanted for the children, they would emphasize very much the value of the environment as a form of protection as well. And this painting that you see here is by a Shipibo artist called Elena Valeria Bauer Hizbe, and she depicts particularly the Shipibo's close connection to plants. They have a lot of knowledge on plants and plant spirits and how these plants can heal people. So one of the main concerns actually of parents was that deforestation and pollution, etc., were making access to these plants more and more difficult, and actually themselves, as they, when they were sick, more dependent on Western medicine as well. And Esther, this mother, told me, I know how to make medicine, so I can heal my children and I can heal other people. So as long as she has access to this medicine, she felt that children would be fine in the future. And this father, Nathan, said, I would like us to be able to reforest, to still have our fishes and animals and our medicinal plants, to at least teach children that. So that's the image of the future as a possibility of reforestation. And I think as a conclusion, what is crucial is to, when we think of social protection, to think about the funding of social protection as well, to consider how this is being provided, and also consider the structural issues that are affecting how social protection is delivered and implemented. And considering the structural causes of impoverishment are actually crucial to ensure that the programs are successful. So when children are old enough that their families do not receive these programs anymore, access to these programs anymore, children would still be able to escape poverty somehow because the structure would be different, which is not what we're seeing at the moment. And the other thing that I think is quite crucial is that we should consider how environmental justice plays a key role in poverty in rural contexts. And in doing so, we should consider first reassess the extractive gains and costs when we make this promise of economic growth as a solution, extractive-led economic growth as a solution to poverty. Rethink well-being beyond economic indicators, and think of the kinds of intersectoral action that would be necessary to also address the existing environmental risks and vulnerabilities that push people into poverty. And finally, consider how Indigenous knowledge can be a form of social protection in itself. So instead of criminalizing, in a way, Indigenous cultures, rethink of how the diet and the child raising cultures that are in place could be supported to promote a better future for children.